Well, hello again, Liberty lovers. Welcome to another exciting interview on Good Morning Liberty. My name is Josh Martens, and joining me today is Charles Amos. Now, Charles is a libertarian political commentator, a frequent debater in the London University scene, and he is a Young Voices contributor. So, Charles, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Joshua.
So, you wrote a great piece in The Critic that really broke down how fair pay is fiction, and I guess over in the UK they are dealing with a lot of this with some of your public sector workers, and they're all the unions are all pitching for fair pay. So I really wanted to go through it because I thought a lot of your points were really, really good. But before we get into that, why don't you take a few minutes to introduce yourself to the listeners and give them kind of your 2-minute liberty story? You know, it says that you are a radical libertarian. So how did you get there?
Well, good evening, and thank you for having me. I got involved in politics when I was 14, when I joined the UK Independence Party, UKIP, to contest our school's mock European elections. And from that somewhat libertarian party that I got involved with, I came across maybe a year or so later Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty. And I read that, and that very quickly converted me to a very radical libertarian position. I think it was probably a couple of months after that I became an anarcho-capitalist. Then when I went to university, I deepened my understanding of libertarianism with Nozick and Rothbard to a greater degree, and Eric Mack, who I think everybody should read, who's little known amongst libertarians. And over the last couple of years, I've been running a blog called themusingindividualist.substack.com. And that's how I became a libertarian and how I am a libertarian now.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about your piece in The Critic, because I thought it was really good. Like I said before we started recording, it was almost like a little bit like libertarianism 2.0, you know, and you really dove into why the idea of fair pay is fiction. So, you know, we hear a lot, even you know, conservatives and some liberty people, you hear them talk about fair pay and people needing more pay and stuff like that. What you made a good argument that it's fiction. So what makes it fiction? Why is the idea of fair pay fiction?
This requires a bit of setting up, so I hope your readers, or rather listeners, don't mind me doing that. So in the moral realm, there is a choice between freedom and prosperity on one hand, and fairness and destitution on the other, particularly when it comes to the labour market. Now, if you have freedom in the labour market, that is employers willing to put forward a price at which they're willing to buy labour, and employees putting forward a price at which they're willing to sell labour, and a negotiation between the two of them comes together to create a price, that is, if you allow supply and demand to operate, you get an equilibrium in the market where you've got a maximization of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. And that ensures our prosperity. That equilibrium, which is at the point of the X, ensures our prosperity. Now, fair pay, as is typically understood amongst common people, in some way puts wages in line with effort or training or the worthiness of the endeavor. I'll repeat that again. Fair pay in some way ties the level of pay to effort, training, or the worthiness of the endeavor. Now, this idea of fairness is going to impoverish the population because the level of effort, training, or worthiness of the role does not follow supply and demand. It will very often be out. And what does this mean? Well, let's say that the level of effort is very high, yeah? And it's above the equilibrium rate. That's going to result in a surplus of workers. So you've got your level of effort, say, that's at £10 or $10, and the clearing rate is $8. Yeah. Now that means you're going to have unemployment because at the margin, some workers you're required to pay $10 because that's the fair rate, the level that's dictated by the amount of effort that you put in, is $2 above the $8 that the free market is demanding clears that supply and demand. So you've got a surplus there. Now, if, on the other hand, the level of effort is, say, $6, whilst the market clearing rate is $8, then you're going to get a shortage of workers. And that is not going to be good either. Now, given that it's really implausible that we should live in a society that has this destitution, which is a result of having this fair pay, I'd just say fair play doesn't exist. Fairness does not require, because it doesn't exist, us to live in destitution. And that's why I say we must choose freedom and prosperity. In the moral realm, it's freedom and prosperity that exists, not fairness and destitution. Clearly, destitution is not the just condition of mankind. So clearly, fairness cannot be a moral value that dictates the level of pay. That is, it doesn't exist.
Sure. So I'm trying to make sure that I follow you exactly. So when you talk about the free market determining pay instead of effort, one thing that you brought up is that just because you are putting in a lot of effort doesn't mean that you're creating a lot of value. So it doesn't always align with the pay. Now, when you talk about, so how then, if the free market pay rate is lower than what they're trying to push for the fair market, how does that then lead to more prosperity moving forward for the individuals that are going to essentially be paid less?
Well, you're quite right in saying that effort cannot determine the level of pay. And the example that I give in the piece is this incompetent civil servant. He might put in twice the amount of effort, but only produce half the amount of output. Clearly, he should not be paid twice the level of the person that he's half as competent as. Now, I will say this, the minimum wage, which is one means to enforce fair pay, does advantage some workers. Those workers who remain in employment are made better off, at least in the short term, as a result of it. But overall, it makes society worse off, because you have at the margin some workers who are, say, producing only $8 worth of stuff, yet because the minimum wage requires them to be paid $10, they're not going to be employed, because employers are thinking, well, why would I want to employ somebody at $10 when they're only producing $8? That means I'd have to make a loss on each $2 loss in each instance. And they're thinking, well, I'm a profit maximizer, I'm not going to do that. So as a result, they just don't employ these people, and these people become unemployed. And if they don't become unemployed, they go into areas in the black market where they're probably going to be less productive, and as a result be paid less than they would if they were in the formal economy. And given everybody faces the prospect of unemployment as a result of the minimum wage, you could argue that it makes a great number of people, even those who are currently in employment, worse off too.
So the concept that we always talk about is how if somebody's not creating the minimum wage of value for their employer, then the employer doesn't have a reason to employ them, because the employer's not coming out ahead. They're not creating enough value for the employer, and then the employees not gaining wisdom, gaining experience and knowledge, so that they can then use those skills in the market to gain more value further on down the line. And so I think I'm following you where that's how it leads to that prosperity is gaining those skills and having that knowledge, because you're able to work. One thing in your piece that I thought was really important is that you talked about it almost in the sense that it's immoral. So people don't tend to usually think of it this way. They usually think that the idea of fair pay is a moral argument, but they're saying that more on an emotional scale. But you said that the principle of human respect requires people to be free of the violence of the state attempting to impose its own phony notion of fair pay on them. And I thought that was a really, really interesting point, because it really talks to self-ownership and people's ability to make their own decisions, and how taking that away is actually an immoral act. Expand on that, because I thought that was a really interesting point.
Along with Robert Nozick and Murray Rothbard, I'm a firm believer that each individual owns himself outright. Each individual is a self-owner. Minimum wages or price controls of any sort on people's labour undermine this self-ownership. And let me give you an analogy. If the government enforced a covenant on your house, which meant that you couldn't sell it below a certain price, I think we'd all say, well, your ownership of that house has diminished somewhat. You don't have the freedom now to lower the price of the house to, say, sell it really quickly if you wanted it to. That freedom has been taken away from you by the government, and they've acquired that freedom in a certain sense, the ability to set the price of your house, or at least prohibit you from doing it. They've gained a degree of ownership over your house. Now, analogously, when the government stops an individual from selling their labour at whatever price that they want, they've gained some kind of ownership over the person. They've denied the person full self-ownership, and they've acquired a partial right, a covenant, like the covenant over the house, over that individual. And what is that? That is the state owning people in some way, having rights over the labour of people. That, in my view, is immoral. Each and every individual is a self-owner, somebody who should be able to do whatever they like with their own person, whether that be prudent or not. And the idea that the state can control us and set the price of our labour is, quite frankly, immoral as far as I'm concerned. And that's what I say in the Critic article.
Yeah, definitely. It's people don't often think about this when it comes to labor, and a lot of times I think that they have a hard time associating labor with the free market, and even how that the free market dictates labor. But essentially, if you take all that other stuff out, what you're saying is that you are negotiating with the person, the business. You are negotiating your amount of labor, and what sets it is what they are willing to pay you and what you are willing to sell your labor for. And if someone else comes in and wants to set, do that work for cheaper, well, that pushes down the amount. We have the same thing going on over in California right now, where the housing market is going really high right now for leased homes, because so many people lost their homes, and now it changes the supply and demand of homes. So the laws of supply and demand work for labor, they work for all those different commodities in the free market. And people, I think, really struggle with that concept when it comes to labor. And I think that it allows them to get into those emotional arguments. What are some of the dangers and ramifications of allowing the state, besides the immoral side, but just allowing the states in economics to dictate that pay? How does that impact the economy and the society as a whole?
Well, we've covered the instance where the state sets the price of labour above the clearing rate, and that results in unemployment. But there's also the other side of the equation, and that's, say, when the government prohibits wages from increasing to the clearing rate. That is, it sets a price ceiling below the market clearing rate, and that results in shortages of workers. It's hard to think of an actual instance in the real world, because we're often very popular to set people's wages below the clearing price. But let's say the government put in place a $24,000 wage that you couldn't exceed for bricklayers. Yeah. and the actual market clearing price was £26,000. And let's say they put this in place because they say, well, bricklaying isn't very worthy because it doesn't involve intellectual endeavor, which is what should determine pay. In that instance, you would have a great demand for bricklayers, and there simply wouldn't be enough bricklayers to meet it. There would be a shortage of them, and people would be willing to sort of go, well, I'll offer to work a bit more if you pay me a bit more. But the government would say, no, we're not allowing you to work anymore, or certainly not for higher rates per hour, because that's unfair, that's socially unjust. And that shortage in the economy, of course, is going to have ramifications elsewhere in increasing housing prices, for example, because obviously the input of labor is more restricted and thus at a higher price.
Sure. I also think one of those ramifications on the other side, when they artificially inflate those wages, all the other wages tend to go up. So over here in the States, if you look at, say, like California, New York, some of those states that have artificially high minimum wage laws, you tend to have an inflated standard of living in a lot of those areas too. You can't get a home for less amount, and it drives people either out, or it doesn't allow for them to even get the job if, like you said before, they don't have the skills. And so it can create. It always seems to hurt the poor the most when they do this. It always affects the people they're trying to help, because it takes them out of the place of being able to actually get the jobs that they're wanting, because again, their skills don't justify the wage they're asking for, or the state is demanding. So we see that over here in the States as well when you look at state per state. So one of the other things that I wanted to try and get into this is because, expand a little bit further on why why you think people get so confused in this, and why this is such a hard concept for people to grasp.
Most people have no understanding of microeconomics at all. And as a result of not understanding basic supply and demand, they can't understand why, if you put a price control above the clearing price, that's going to result in unemployment. Instead, they see those who oppose minimum wages, instead of being against them for reasons of social welfare or violating rights, they see them as evil people who simply hate the poor. Maybe that's a bit too strong, but they certainly question their motives, which I think is a great shame. It's one of the reasons why I want to see economics taught in schools to a greater extent. It's certainly a shame that it's not really taught until about 16 years old over here, and even then it's a choice, which I think it should be, but it's a shame that it's not a choice that they can make at a younger age to study economics, that is.
Yeah, definitely. I say the same thing. Economics should be the forefront of education. One thing that I wanted you to expand further on, and you talked about this a little bit in your piece when it came to bricklayers, is a lot of people think of pay in like training. If they have more training, they should get paid more. If they have more tenure, they should get paid more. Or like we talked about before, they have more effort, they should get paid more. But those things don't really tie in to pay at all. Even though we've structured a lot of our pay increases around those kind of things. Expand on that again, because you really did a great job of breaking that down, using the example of a bricklayer, and I thought it was a great point.
Well, bricklayers may work harder, say, because it rains more. Yeah, which makes it harder to lift the bricks and to lay them with the cement. Now, if you're taking fair pay to be tied to effort, then you'd have to increase their pay. But let's imagine this, that a load of people suddenly thought, right, I don't want to actually be a bricklayer anymore. I want to go and become a waiter in a restaurant. And this seriously restricts the supply of labor to that market. It shifts the supply curve to the left. Now, the rain should make, say, the wage go up by 5%. But all of the workers moving out should make the wage go up by, say, 20%. And as a result of the wage only going up by 5%, as opposed to it going up by 20%, which is what the free marketeers would want, because that's what would equilibrate the wage, you're going to find that you're going to have a shortage of bricklayers. And you'll also find this, that the very same bricklayers that are saying, well, I'm working more, I should get paid more, will suddenly actually go, actually, no, I'll just take the 20%. They'll be quite happy to take the 20% in this instance, not because they're working much harder, they're only working, say, 5% harder, but simply because it's in their self-interest now. You know, when the supply of labor shrinks, and the supply of labor can shrink basically because a load of people just want to leave the profession for whatever reason, wages are going to go up. And in many cases, there's going to be no extra work whatsoever. So I think the other example I give in the piece is chefs. Now, a load of people, right, just decide I don't want to be a chef anymore. Now, the chefs that are working exactly the same number of hours and exactly the same intensity, they're going to get paid a lot more, and they're going to be happy about that. Now, if they were so determined to say my pay should just be determined by how hard I work, then they shouldn't get any more pay at all. But they'll quite happily take it because in instances where the supply of labor contracts, it's in their interest, even though they're not doing any more work.
So I really liked this analogy because, again, a lot of times people think that if I work hard, I should get paid more. If I'm, so that if I put in more effort, I should get paid more. If I go and get a bunch of extra training, I should get paid more. But again, if that extra training doesn't bring in more value, if that extra effort doesn't bring in more value, if you're tenured and you have a lot of experience, but you're not bringing in more value, then the pay doesn't increase. And one thing that when you were talking about the bricklayers, I also liked your analogy where you said, if you had all of a sudden a bunch of bricklayers that started working, even if each one was really skilled, it's going to drive the pay down because you have so many different people doing it. So that supply and demand just goes in the opposite direction. And we are actually seeing this in real time over here in the States with our Port Authority workers that just went through that strike. During the pandemic, a lot of workers saw pay increases and different things because of the demand on their labor and the pandemic things going on. And unfortunately for a lot of the union workers, like the port workers, they didn't see any increases because they were locked in to what they had previously thought was a fair pay. So now they're saying, well, what about us? What about us? Well, if they had left it to the free market and supply and demand, then they would have been, their pay would have been adjusted during the time that the demand was more for them back, earlier. So we see it both sides, but whether it's the government locking in or unions locking in, it's the same kind of thing. It's artificially locking at a certain wage, even though it doesn't always reflect the supply and demand. And I thought that was a really, really good analogy that you put, because it really did break it down in a very simple way for people to grasp. So I have just one more question for you, something that I ask everybody. So if you had the chance to make one change for liberty, if you could wave that magic wand and make one change that either open people's eyes to liberty or move them closer to liberty, move society closer to liberty, what is something that you would do?
I would abolish all of the green belts in the UK. And green belts are land use regulations imposed by the state around urban areas, in particular London, Oxford and Cambridge, and they essentially nationalise land and stop landowners from doing as they please with their land, which is typically to build houses on it or to build something on it. And as far as I'm concerned, this is just socialism. If you take away all of the rights of people to do as they wish with their own land and basically say you can just put sheep on it or grow grass or grain, you've basically taken away all of their rights, and that really constitutes socialism, because socialism is the state having the right over all of its citizens' property. So I would get rid of these wretched green belts. They push up house prices here in the UK immensely. 8 times average income house prices here in the UK. If you look at the southeast, it's 10 times. If you look at London, it's 12 times. It's ridiculous. And I'd recommend listeners buy Brian Kaplan's new book, Build, Baby Build, which I reviewed. It's a graphic novel and it's pretty good and explains the problem in the United States with land use regulation and how it should all be totally abolished.
Definitely. I'm not overly familiar with the green belts, but it sounds a lot like our pricing controls and the controls that they have over here as well. And yes, it when you are not able to do what you want with your land, then you don't truly own the land in the same way that you don't truly own your own body. And it just goes back to that self-ownership. So no, that's an excellent one. That's very high on my list. I'll definitely put that recommendation in the show notes. That sounds great. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can find more of your work?
I should just add another book that I think your readers might be interested in is the second volume of Hayek's Law, Legislation and Liberty, from which I've taken the arguments that I've put forward this evening. The best place to find my own work is themusingindividualist.substack.com, where I discuss cultural issues and political philosophy from an individualist point of view in the fashion of Ayn Rand, Murray Rothbard, Eric Mack.
Awesome. And can they find you on Twitter as well, or X, as unfortunately we have to call it now?
Yes, my Twitter handle is @Mr. Charles Amos.
All right. Well, I'll definitely get those in the show notes so that listeners can find it easily. And I'll have your article to the critic in there as well. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for taking the time on an evening. Charles is out in London, listeners, so it's pretty late for him. He's gonna finish up here and have a brandy or a bourbon or something and enjoy his evening. So I really appreciate you taking the time to go through your article. It was a very good read.
Thank you very much for having me, Joshua.
So, all right, Liberty lovers, make sure you go and check out Charles's work and go through his articles. It's really, really good stuff. I was very impressed. He really breaks it down well. So go and check out his work. And don't forget to go and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You know what I always say, we got to make the algorithms happy. But more importantly, it helps get these messages and this knowledge out to many more people. And if we want to make converts instead of have arguments, that's the way to do it. So go and leave those ratings and reviews and make those algorithms happy. So also, if you know of somebody that I need to interview, hit me up. You can reach me at josh@goodmorningliberty.us. So send me the email and tell me all about the person I need to interview, and I will look into it. So if you do all that, I promise I'm going to be back next time with another exciting person that you all need to know. Until then, remember, you own your choices, each and every one. So make some good ones. I hope you all have a good night, a good day, and a good morning, Liberty.